MAC and physical layers. In this video, we're going to learn how do wireless LANs communicate, meaning how does a wireless station actually send data wirelessly to the wireless access point and receive data from the wireless access point. It's very important that we understand this from an administrator point of view because there are configurable communication parameters on a wireless access point that can either optimize the efficiency of a wireless access point or a wireless network in general, or we can shoot ourselves in the foot. So it's very good to know this information from a troubleshooting and optimization standpoint. So if you were to go into a wireless access point and tweak a parameter, that might as a result just all of a sudden increase the overhead on your wireless network. So we need to be careful what we're tweaking. So in this video we're going to learn the key components as to what we need to tweak that affects the communication on our wireless LANs, such as interframe spacing, RTS, CTS process, modulation, the wireless LAN frames versus Ethernet frames, how do wireless packets deal with collisions on a wireless network, etc. So we got a lot of good stuff here in this video. Hang on, get your favorite beverage, close that door because we're going to get started here. So first off, we're going to learn about the key components that are used with wireless LAN communication, as we see here on this whiteboard. So we're going to learn about each of these topics individually to learn and understand how wireless LANs communicate with each other. So first off, what are wireless LAN frames? Let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about what those are. Now, wireless clients will communicate on a wireless LAN by transmitting frames, also referred to as packets, on the wireless LAN. Now, these frames are different from the frames that are transmitted on an 802.Ethernet network. Wireless frames have a little more information than Ethernet frames. Now, there are three main types of frames that are transmitted on a wireless LAN. There are control frames that contain power save polling information. There are management frames, which, as we learned in the previous video, contain authentication information, contain probe request, probe response information, beacon information. And then lastly, there's the good old data frame, which actually contains the content of what you're sending. So, for example, the email message you're sending is in a data frame. Now, on a wireless LAN, the maximum frame size can be 2,000 up to 2,346 bytes in size. Now, this is larger than the maximum frame size on an Ethernet network. On an Ethernet network, the maximum frame size is 1,518 bytes, so the wireless frame is typically fragmented at this lower amount here. And we'll learn more about fragmentation here in just a second. Now, within the frame is also a little preamble, and the preamble is used for synchronization. It's set at the beginning of each frame that it's sent. Now, the thing you need to know about this preamble is that it's always sent at 1 megabit per second. And the reason why the preamble is sent at such a very low data rate is that it's a common data rate that's held among all wireless LAN devices that comply with the 802.11 specifications and standards. And we can see this, an example of this, by bringing up our wireless LAN protocol analyzer. And we see that within this frame, which is a management frame, the data rate of this frame that it was sent at is 1 megabit. And so, again, this is the preamble of this management frame. Let's go back to our whiteboard here. Now, the type of frames that we can send on a wireless LAN, or the type of protocols, rather, that we can send on the wireless LAN, are the same protocols that can be sent on the layer 3 through 7 of the OSI model. OSI stands for Open System Interconnection. And the OSI model, as you probably know, has 7 layers to it. And these 7 layers are basically used to explain how the computers are going to be able to communicate with each other. How when you send data from the application, it gets all the way from the application out through the physical adapter that is connected to your computer, whether that's Ethernet or wireless LAN or token ring, etc. So wireless LAN supports all the protocols that are used at the layer 3 through 7 of the OSI model, such as IP or IPX, which is used with Novell networks, RIP, which is used for routing, FTP, etc. So wireless LAN devices are able to communicate with each other by passing these frames back and forth between the devices. However, sometimes these frames can bump into each other, which is referred to as collisions. Let's bring up a whiteboard and learn about collisions and what happens when they collide and how they can avoid colliding. So just like in real life where collisions are a bad thing, we don't want two cars colliding with each other, we don't want our kids colliding with each other. Well, on our networks, we don't want frames colliding with each other. So if we have two stations that send data simultaneously, that data is going to collide with each other. And a wireless LAN uses different rules governing collisions on a wireless network. This rule is called CSMA-CA, which stands for Carrier Sense Multiple Access Collision Avoidance. In contrast, on an Ethernet network, it uses the rule CSMA-CD, which stands for Carrier Sense Multiple Access, and you can probably guess this, Collision Detection. So the key difference between these two rules is that with a CSMA with CD on an Ethernet network, the network is being monitored all the time for trying to detect if a collision has occurred. So what happens is if no transmission is taking place, a node on the network, a host on the network can transmit their data, transmit those frames. However, if you've got two stations or two nodes on the network that attempt to transmit simultaneously, well, that's going to cause a collision. And when a collision has occurred on an Ethernet network, what will happen is that the nodes on the network will attempt to retransmit their frames at a random offset time, also known as a backoff period. And so this is what happens on an Ethernet network. And another way you can think of this is that I'm a packet at the side of the road at a very, very busy intersection. So this busy intersection is the packets going by. So I'm standing at the side of the road looking both ways, and then when the packet thinks that it's clear, it runs for it. It just tries to shoot across the street, and then all of a sudden, bang, it gets hit by a truck. Well, that's collision detection right at work. That packet limps back to the corner and tries to retransmit again. However, on a wireless LAN, it is impossible to detect if a collision has actually occurred. So as a result, on wireless LAN, it uses collision avoidance versus collision detection. Now, on a wireless LAN using collision avoidance, what happens is first the wireless station sends a packet, and then the receiving station, if it received the packet, will send an acknowledgement back in the form of a ACK frame, or ACK, which stands for acknowledgement. Now, if the sending station doesn't receive back an ACK, doesn't receive back an acknowledgement that it had received the frame that it had sent, then the sending station assumes that there was a collision and resends the data. So the acknowledgement packets are a method to determine if a collision has actually occurred or not. But again, with CA, with collision avoidance, it tries to avoid the probability of a collision to begin with. And it does this by using what's referred to as a random backoff time. So what happens on a wireless LAN is that the wireless stations will monitor the wireless network for activity. And all the wireless stations are waiting on the side of the road, if you will, with their bated breath, waiting for an idle period. So they're sensing, they're saying, yeah, it's busy, there's traffic going by, it's slowed down, there's no traffic, I look to the left, look to the right, there's nothing there, so I'll try to send my frames now. Well, the problem is that all the wireless stations use that same logic. They're all waiting for the wireless LAN to reach an idle period. Well, that's where the random backoff time comes into play. Each wireless station will have its own unique random backoff time. So it's a period of time that they will wait before they transmit a frame when an idle period has reached. So we get an idle period, station 1 might transmit its frame, and then because station 2 has a different random backoff time, it'll transmit its frame at a little bit of a later time. Now, there's a couple of things you need to commit to memory in regards to wireless LAN using collision avoidance. As I stated right at the beginning, the wireless stations can't detect if a collision has actually occurred. They assume a collision has occurred if they don't receive an acknowledgement packet back, but they're not able to physically detect if a collision has occurred. Also, the use of CSMA with collision avoidance causes a tremendous amount of overhead, which as a result utilizes almost 50% of the bandwidth. That is right, 50% of the available bandwidth. So for example, if your wireless LAN is using 802.11b devices, which have a maximum data rate of 11 megabits per second, the actual throughput, the highest maximum actual throughput will be about 5.5 megabits per second because of this overhead that is caused by using CSMA CA. Now, something else that can be done to help reduce the likelihood of the frames colliding is to reduce the size of the packets, and this is referred to as fragmentation. Let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about fragmentation. So the basic idea of fragmentation is that if you have really large packets being sent around on a wireless LAN or even on a wired LAN, the larger the packets are, the more space they're going to take up, and the greater the likelihood of those packets colliding. So on a wireless LAN, there is a threshold of the packet size, and that threshold, or the maximum size for a packet before it is fragmented or broken up into multiple pieces, is 2,346 bytes. Now, wireless vendors implement this fragmentation threshold at different levels. Some will keep it at the default rate of 2,346. Others will keep it at the rate of 1,500 bytes. And that's due to the fact that in order to send the frames from the wireless network to a wired network, the maximum frame size on a wired network is only 1,518 bytes. So let's see an example of this by looking at the threshold level on different access points. Let's first look at the threshold level on a Proxima access point. So we see here highlighted the maximum packet size is 1,500 bytes, and again that allows for the frames that are transmitted on the wireless LAN to also be transmitted on the wire to an Ethernet LAN. So if a frame that needs to be transmitted is larger than 1,500 bytes in size, passes this threshold, what will happen is that the frame will be broken up or fragmented into smaller pieces. And what happens then is that each of these pieces or each of these fragments has a unique number on it. And that allows the recipient to know whether or not all the pieces, all the fragments have been received. So they're uniquely numbered, and an acknowledgement is sent by the recipient saying, hey, I got piece number 1 as an example. So what happens then is that the sending station can't transmit the next fragment until the previous fragment has actually been acknowledged. So I'm going to send fragment number 1, then I'm going to wait for an acknowledgement from the recipient to say, I got fragment number 1. And then at that point, it'll send fragment number 2, so on and so forth, until all the fragments have been sent. And just a little note here, you can see that the access point uses CSMA CA, as we learned about just a moment ago. Now let's take a look at the fragmentation threshold on another access point, which is a Linksys access point. You can see here that the fragmentation threshold is at the default maximum rate of 2,346, and it's configurable. So what this means is that for this particular wireless access point, it can transmit frames as large as 2,346 on the wireless network. However, it will have to fragment the frames that are being transmitted from the wireless network to the wired Ethernet network in order to stay within Ethernet rules for fragmentation size. Once again, the maximum size of a frame on an Ethernet network is 1,518 bytes. Now, there's sometimes a little bit of a confusion around this point. Now, again, the IEEE 802.3 standard specifies that the maximum Ethernet frame size is 1,518 bytes. And this is also referred to as the maximum transfer unit, or MTU. Now, of this 1,518 bytes, 18 bytes are used by the Ethernet destination address and source address and length, so it's used by Ethernet information, and that leaves 1,500 bytes left over for the protocol. And assuming you're using TCP/IP, the maximum size of the IP packet within that Ethernet frame is 1,500 bytes. So oftentimes you'll hear this expressed as Ethernet has a maximum transfer unit of 1,500 bytes. So again, these are the different fragmentation sizes, or the maximum transmission unit, or MTU size, used on different access points. However, there are trade-offs by fragmenting these frames. Number one, fragmenting helps to decrease the chance of collisions. However, by taking these frames and breaking up into smaller pieces, it actually causes additional overhead. So for example, assuming that you're using TCP/IP on a network, each frame that has been fragmented into these smaller fragments, or these smaller pieces, will contain their own IP header. It's information that is at the beginning of the frame, and it's information that's vital as well. It contains information for reassembling the original frame back together again in its original unfragmented format. So let's say, for example, it's been fragmented into 10 different fragments, 10 different pieces. The destination station needs to know how to put them together again in their original format so you can read that email message. So we need to have the instructions to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Well, by having these IP headers on each of these fragments, each of these pieces, that's additional information. That's additional data that's sent. That's more bytes of data that's being sent over the network. So as a result, fragmentation actually causes additional overhead. And again, though, the benefit of this overhead is that you're decreasing the likelihood of collisions from occurring with larger frames. And there's a balance that you need to have between the fragmentation threshold, or the NTU size, and this overhead. So remember, though, if the larger the fragment is, the more collisions you'll have, and that will actually decrease network throughput, because if there's a collision, remember what happens. If there's a collision, the recipient is not going to receive that, and it's not going to send out an acknowledgement. And when the sender doesn't get that acknowledgement, remember what happens. The sender is going to resend that frame that it didn't receive an acknowledgement for. And this resending of the frame is actually going to cause more traffic on the network, and as a result, reduce network throughput. So by using a wireless protocol analyzer, you can sniff out the traffic to see if there's a heavy packet error rate, meaning that you've got a lot of these retransmissions of these frames occurring on the network, and as a result, that's clogging up the network and reducing the throughput on the network. So if you're encountering that and you're sniffing that out, you want to incrementally adjust the fragmentation threshold. Just notch it down bit by bit, and each time you notch it down, you want to put that sniffer on the wire and see the result of that incremental change. And you'll want to find that sweet spot of the fragmentation threshold size that doesn't cause too much overhead, so you're getting a reduced throughput because you're putting more frames on the wire, but you're reducing the chance of collisions, and as a result, you're reducing the retransmission. So you're trying to find that sweet spot, and the only way you can find that sweet spot is just through constant monitoring for each incremental change that you make to that fragmentation threshold. And speaking of incrementals, something else you need to realize is that the data rate will jump incrementally as well, depending on the distance that the station is from the wireless access point. Let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about that. So what happens is, as the station increases or decreases its distance from the wireless access point, the data rate will dynamically adjust. However, most people think that the data rate will dynamically adjust in little steps. So for example, if you have a 802.11b wireless LAN, people think that it'll just jump from or step down from 11 megabits to 10 megabits to 9 megabits, etc. Well, that's not the case. What actually happens is there are discrete jumps that are made from one data rate to another as the wireless station increases or decreases its distance to the access point. So for example, let's say that you have a wireless LAN with 802.11b devices. Now, the further away the wireless station moves from the wireless access point, the signal strength will start to decrease. And it'll start to decrease to a point where it's going to drop its data rate. It's going to jump from one supported data rate to another. So on an 802.11b network, if it gets further enough away from that access point, it's going to drop its data rate from 11 megabits per second and jump down to the next supported rate to 5.5 megabits per second. So something that you want to do during your site survey, which we'll learn about in the site survey video in this exam pack, is to find that the distance from the access point where the signal strength decreases and this discrete jump from one supported data rate to another data rate occurs. Let's say, for example, and this is just purely out of the air, maybe the data rate will jump from 11 megabits to 5.5 megabits if you're 20 feet away from the wireless access point. So ideally, you want to place the stations within this circle of 20 feet around that wireless access point to give them that strongest data rate. the fastest data rate. So moving forward here, there's actually two modes in which access points send data on a wireless network. And let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about those two modes. The first mode is Distributed Coordination Function, or a DCF for short, and the second mode is Point Coordination Function, or PCF for short. DCF is typically the default mode in which a wireless access points send data on the wireless LAN, and DCF really summarizes a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. When a wireless access point is configured to use DCF, it allows all the wireless stations on the wireless LAN to contend for access on the wireless LAN. By contention, I mean that you have the wireless stations that are contending for or competing for network access. So as a result, we might have two or more wireless stations that are trying to send their frames simultaneously, and at that point, they'll be in contention. They'll be competing with each other to try to send their frames simultaneously. And when contention happens, that's when the contention protocol steps in. And in a wireless network, the contention protocol is CSMA-CA. So basically, DCF is a transfer method for sending data on a wireless network by contending for access. In contrast, Point Coordination Function, or PCF, is a contention-free method for transferring data on a wireless network. A wireless access point that's running in PCF mode can transfer data on the wireless network contention-free by using a polling mechanism. So the 1, 2, 3s of how this works is, first off, the wireless station has to inform the wireless access point that it's actually capable of answering the poll, because the access point is responsible for the polling. So step number 1, the client has to say, yes, I can answer a poll, no problem. Then what will happen at that point is that the access point will ask or poll the wireless station to see if it actually needs to send any data frames, send any information across the network. So by using PCF, what is essentially happening here is that the wireless stations are taking turns to send their frames on the wireless network instead of contending to try to send their frames simultaneously and butting heads and colliding with each other. So I can hear you saying out there, well, PCF sounds pretty cool. Why don't I use it? Well, number 1, PCF is an optional 802.11 standard, so as a result, not all vendors implement this option on their access points. And number 2, as you can probably imagine, this polling causes additional overhead. Now, the big advantage for using PCF, if you can enable it on your access point, is that it guarantees a known amount of latency for transferring the frames, which is extremely important for applications that need a certain amount of quality of service, such as voice applications and video applications. You're going to be viewing a streaming video across your wireless LAN or something like that. Now, to better understand both DCF and PCF, we need to learn about something called interframe spacing. And to learn about interframe spacing, let's bring up another whiteboard. Interframe spacing is part of the how wireless LANs communicate puzzle, and by looking at these pieces of the puzzle, we'll be able to better understand both DCF and PCF and how wireless LANs communicate as a whole. So first off, what is interframe spacing? Well, it's a standardized amount of time that is an 802.11 specifications that wireless LANs use to either defer a station's access to the medium, meaning the wireless network, and to provide different levels of priority to the wireless network. And there are 3 different types of interframe spacing on wireless LANs that comply to the 802.11 wireless LAN specifications. The first type is short interframe space, or SIFS for short. Point coordination interframe space, or PIFS. And lastly, distributed coordination interframe space, or DIFS for short. Okay, so you might be saying to yourself, wow, that really clears it up. Thanks, Todd. Well, it's going to get a lot easier to understand here in just a second. But the basics of interframe spacing is that it's an amount of time where nothing happens before something transpires. It's a gap in time. It's a space in time, if you will, before an action on the wireless LAN transpires. And these gaps in times are technically referred to as an interframe space. It's an amount of time that occurs between when frames are sent. And the interframe space is measured in microseconds. And let me show you a whiteboard that has the actual duration of these interframe spacing times. So we see the technology that's being used across the top, and then along the side here we see the actual different types of interframe spacing. So starting at the top, we have SIFS, which has the shortest duration for both access points that are using DSSS and FHSS. So it's using 10 microseconds. That is the duration of time that elapses for an SIFS, and 28 microseconds is the duration of time that elapses when an access point is using the FHSS technology. So you can see that the duration of time increases as we go down the list here from SIFS to FIFS and DIFS. Say these 10 times fast. So we're going from 10 to 30 to 50, from 28 to 78 to 128 microseconds. Okay, so that's all well and good, but now we need to know why these interframe spaces are actually used. So this is the duration of time used by these different types, but why are they used? Well, to explain that, let's bring up another whiteboard here. And again, as we just saw in the previous whiteboard, an SIFS interframe space has the shortest duration of time. But what is an SIFS? What is it actually used for? Well, these are time spaces that are included before and after these types of frames are sent. A RTS, which is request to send frame, a CTS, which is a clear to send frame, and we'll learn more about RTS and CTS at the latter part of this video, and a frame type that we've already learned about, which is ACK, an acknowledgement frame type. So before an acknowledgement frame is sent, it'll have a little gap in time. So before we send that acknowledgement packet, a period of time called the SIFS has to elapse before and after sending the acknowledgement. And the wireless access point and the wireless stations are able to synchronize when these SIFs should occur, because remember again, when a wireless station boots up, it finds out the time on a wireless access point by using the beacons, and once it finds out that time, it'll synchronize its time. It'll adjust the clock on the wireless station with the clock on the wireless access point. So in doing so, their clocks are in sync and they're marching in time with each other. And the duration of these three types of interframe spacing is actually hard-coded into the wireless LAN devices. So again, an SIFS is a time space that occurs before and after these types of frames are sent. But they also provide the highest level of priority as well. Well, what does that mean? Well, what happens here is that the wireless stations are always listening to the medium. And in a wireless network, the medium is the radio frequency in the channel. And this is technically referred to as carrier sense. And they're always waiting for the medium to be clear so they can send their frames. Well, once the medium is actually clear, each station must wait a given amount of time, which is a time spacing, before actually sending the frames. And the amount of time that a station has to wait before it sends the frames is determined by what it has to do, or by the function that the actual wireless station needs to perform. And these functions that a wireless station needs to perform falls into different interframe spacing categories. And these functions that are a high priority fall into the SIFS category of interframe space. So sending an acknowledgement frame is a very high priority function or a high priority task, and as a result that falls into the SIFS category and it gives it a high priority. So in this situation, if a wireless station only has to wait a short period of time after the medium is cleared to begin sending its frames, then it would have priority over other stations having to wait longer periods of time. So to wrap that all up, an SIFS is used for tasks or functions that require a very short period of time to complete. Remember, an SIFS has the shortest duration of the three different types of interframe spacing, and those tasks or these functions require a high priority in order to complete those functions. And our next type of interframe spacing is PIFS. Let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about that puppy. So if you remember on the table we saw just a second ago, PIFS is sandwiched in between SIFS and DIFS. And it's second in line as far as the duration of time is concerned and the priority that it gets. Now, PIFS is not seen that often because access points will only use PIFS when they're running in PCF mode. And if you remember, we just learned a few minutes ago that this mode is within the standards of 802.11 specifications, but it's an optional standard. So the vendors have the option as to whether or not they want to enable this mode on their access points. So PIFS, interframe spacing, is only used when the access point is running in PCF mode. So if PCF mode is available on a access point and is enabled, a PIFS is, because it's shorter in duration than a DIFS, will have higher priority than a DIFS. Now, something you need to be aware of is that PCF and DCF are not mutually exclusive. In order to enable PCF mode, the DCF mode has to be enabled as well. So it's not one or the other. Both of them are running simultaneously and in coordination with each other. So PCF kind of runs on top of DCF. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, if that's the case, if the advantage of using PCF is that the wireless access points will poll the stations to see if they have any data to send, where does DCF come into play then? So remember that PCF is the contention-less method of transferring frames, and DCF is the contention method of sending frames. So you think, well, wouldn't they just compete with each other and butt heads with each other, or how can they work simultaneously? Well, what happens is, once the access point has completed its PCF mode, if you will, once it's finished polling the stations, what will happen is the other stations can continue to contend for the medium in DCF mode. So basically, after polled the stations that are also running in PCF mode and have responded, any of the other stations that have not responded and don't respond to these PCF polls will operate as per normal in DCF mode. Now again, a PIFS is only used when an access point is running in PCF mode, and how they're used is very similar to how a SIFS is used. Again, when a station is always lurking in the background, always listening for the medium to be clear. Well, in PCF mode, the stations will wait until the medium is clear, and then once it's clear, they must wait a PIFS time space before actually sending their frames. And now let's learn about our last type of interframe spacing, which is DIFS. And again, as we saw in the table, a DIFS has the longest duration compared to SIFS and PIFS. And this type of frame is used when the access points and the stations are running in DCF mode. And how a DIFS is used is that each wireless station that is running in DCF mode is required to wait until this interframe space, the DIFS interframe space time period, has expired before the stations can actually contend for the medium. So remember that the DCF mode is a contention-based method for gaining access to the medium. So before the stations can contend for the medium, they have to wait for this interframe time space to elapse for it to expire before they can actually start that contention. And a DIFS is used for transmitting management and data frames. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, if all the wireless stations are just waiting for bated breath, they're kind of sitting at the side of the road waiting for this DIFS time period to expire so they can contend for the medium and gain access to it, wouldn't there be a lot of collisions? Well, remember what we learned earlier, that in DCF mode, a random back-off period is involved. And what happens here is that after the DIFS has expired, the stations will use this random back-off algorithm to compute the period of time that they're going to wait. So they'll use a random back-off period in conjunction with something called a slot time to calculate how much time a station will wait before it'll actually contend for the medium. So before we move forward with this, let's discuss what slot time is by bringing up another whiteboard. Now, first off, the period of time that directly follows when the DIFS time space has elapsed is called the contention period, or CP. And this is critical because what happens is all stations running in DCF mode will run this random back-off algorithm during this contention period. So the DIFS duration of time has elapsed. We enter in contention period. Then the random back-off algorithm kicks in during the contention period. And then what's going to happen at this point is that the station calculates the random back-off time by picking a random number and then multiplying that by a slot time. Now, a slot time is a standard amount of time that is hard-coded into the radio of the wireless network adapter and the wireless access point, and slot times are used within the contention period, similar to how the second hand is used on a clock. It's just ticking off one by one. Just this wireless station ticks off these slot times. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and what happens is the station will count down these slot times one by one, and each time it counts down these slot times, it performs what is called a clear channel assessment, or a CCA. So it's basically seeing, is the coast clear? Is the medium clear? So I tick off a slot time, I perform a clear channel assessment to see if the medium is busy. So what happens then is the wireless station that has its random backup time expire first and does a clear channel assessment to assess that the medium is clear and it's available, it will then begin transmitting its frames. And what will happen now is that because the wireless station is transmitting frames on the medium, the other wireless stations, when they perform a clear channel assessment, will find that the medium is busy and they'll hold off. But you might be thinking now, okay, well, they were in the midst of this random backup time. Do they have to start all over again? Well, what happens in this instance is the stations will remember the remaining amount of their random backup time from the previous contention period. So to ensure that all wireless stations will eventually have access to the medium, the remaining amount of the random backup time is used instead of generating a brand new random backup time during the next contention period and starting all over again. So again, this entire process is done because on a wireless network, it's not possible to detect if collisions have occurred. So this is all part and parcel of the process to try to avoid collisions from happening. And again, a collision is assumed to have occurred if the sending station doesn't receive back an acknowledgement. So let's solidify what we've just learned, and let's look at this process step by step. I bring up another whiteboard here. So first off, we've got a couple of wireless stations that are running in DCF mode that want to transmit some data. And again, DCF mode is a contention-based method for gaining access to the network, which is used in conjunction with the CSMA CA contention protocol. So in order for the wireless stations to transmit frames while they're running in DCF mode, they have to wait for the DIFS interframe time-space period for that duration of time to expire. That's step number one. Once that time space has expired, once the DIFS has expired, then the stations enter into this void, if you will, called the CP. And CP stands for, anybody help me out here? That's right, the contention period. So once the stations have entered into this contention period, they will then generate the random backoff time by taking a random number and multiplying that by the slot time. So their next step here is that once the wireless stations have their random time, that a fixed amount of time that they're supposed to wait before they try to gain access to the medium, they will then tick off the random time. They'll tick down the amount of random time that they have with each passing slot time. So again, this is similar to looking at your watch and looking at the second hand of your watch go by and you're saying, okay, 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, so that 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000 would be the equivalent of the slot time. And as each slot time goes by, I'm ticking down the remaining amount of random time that I have to wait. But at each interval, as each slot time passes, the station will perform a clear channel assessment to assess whether or not the medium is busy. And at the point when the time expires, when all the random time has expired, the station will perform the clear channel assessment, see if the medium is busy. If it's not busy, they win, and then they can start sending their data, start sending the frames on the medium. So now that the wireless station is able to send frames, it's going to wait for an acknowledgement from the recipient before it starts sending more frames. And again, what happens in this process is that the receiving station will receive these frames, and then it's going to wait for the SIFS duration to expire before it sends that acknowledgement. Remember that an SIFS is padded before and after an acknowledgement. And then at that point, the sending station receives the acknowledgement, and then the entire process starts all over again from step number 1 going all the way down to step number 6. You think, wow, I have to go through all that again? Well, remember, this is all occurring in microseconds, so incredibly, incredibly fast. Now, this is actually one method out of 2 methods that DCF mode supports for transmitting data on a wireless network. Let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about the second method, which is called request to send, clear to send, or RTS/CTS for short. So the 2 methods supported by DCF are a 2-way handshaking method and a 4-way handshaking method. Now, we've just learned about the 2-way handshaking method, which is the process that the clients go through to gain access to the wireless medium and then wait for an acknowledgement to be sent back for the data that they had sent. So the first step is gaining access to the medium, and then the second step, or the second part of the handshake of sending the data, is waiting for the acknowledgement back. And both of these methods occur at the MAC sublayer in the OSI model, meaning that the data link layer, which is layer 2, is actually divided into 2 sublayers. The first sublayer is the media access control sublayer, or the MAC sublayer, and the second one is the logical link control, or LCC sublayer. And through the methods that we've been learning about in this video, the MAC sublayer controls how a wireless station gains access to the data and the subsequent permission to transmit the data on the wireless medium. And CSMA/CA works at this sublayer to ensure that the frames that are sent by different stations avoid colliding with each other. So RTS/CTS is the second method for transmitting data on the wireless medium at the MAC sublayer of the OSI model. And using this method, it allows the wireless stations to send the data by first broadcasting their intent to do so to all of the wireless stations on the network. And right off the top of your head, you're probably thinking, okay, broadcast all the wireless stations, that's going to be a lot of traffic. And yes, that is a lot of traffic. And as a result, you'll find that RTS/CTS is not enabled as a default on wireless access points. So let's bring up another whiteboard and learn about the steps that are involved in the RTS/CTS process. So when RTS/CTS is used to transmit data on the wireless LAN, this is essentially a 4-step process. And the very first step is to send out a broadcast of the sending station intent for sending frames on the wireless network. So it first sends out a request to send frame. Hey, I would like to use the wireless medium. I'm requesting to use the wireless medium. And this request to send frame will be broadcasted out, but it'll have the MAC address of the recipient. So the recipient station will be listening to this stuff on the wire, and then it'll eventually say, hey, you know what, that's me. I'm this MAC address, and sure, you can send me data. So the second step is the recipient, the receiving station, will send back a clear to send, or a CTS frame. So that's step number 2. Then the third step of this process is simply that the client now has access to the wireless medium, and that the client sends the data frames to the recipient, to the endpoint. And then the fourth step in this process is the same as what we've learned before, is that the sending station, or the transmitting station, needs to receive an acknowledgement, because again, this is a wireless network and it's not able to detect whether or not collisions have occurred, so it uses the acknowledgement, or the ACK frame, to determine whether or not a collision has occurred. And again, that's an assumption that's made on the part of the transmitting wireless station. If it does not receive an acknowledgement for the data that it had sent, it's going to make the assumption that a collision had occurred. And at that point, it'll retransmit the original frame, the original data frame. So it's a pretty basic process. I'm going to announce my intent to use the wireless medium. So please, can I request the use of the wireless medium? It's going to wait back for a clear to send. Yeah, everything's okay. Go ahead, send your data. Sure thing. I'm going to send my data, and then it's going to wait for an acknowledgement back. But I'd like to add a little more information about the very first step of this process. So again, the wireless station will broadcast its intent to reserve the wireless medium so it can send data to a specific wireless station. Now, during that process, what will happen is all the wireless stations will hear this broadcast. and all the wireless stations except for the recipient or the receiving wireless station will set a field on itself called the network allocation vector. And the network allocation vector, or what's also referred to as the NAV or NAV field, is a timer on all the stations. So what will happen is that this timer is set to the time necessary for the sending wireless station to complete the transmission plus the time that it takes to receive the acknowledgement frame back from the receiving station. And this four-step process, or this four-way handshake, is used for every single frame that is sent across the wireless network. So that, as a result, adds a tremendous amount of overhead to your wireless network. So you might be thinking to yourself, why in the world would I use RTS-CTS if it adds this additional burden of this overhead? Well, if the wireless LAN is experiencing a very, very high collision rate, which is typically as the result of transmitting very large packets, then the process of requesting to send and then being cleared to send it will actually reduce the collisions and as a result increase throughput marginally due to the overhead. But it'll actually give you a little more throughput than an environment that has extremely high collision rate. And as I mentioned before, as a default, RTS-CTS is disabled as a default. And there's actually three settings for the RTS-CTS functionality. The first is off, the second is on, and then the third is on with a threshold. So let's take a look at this setting on my Proxima wireless access point, which is found underneath the Interfaces Wireless tab. And if we scroll down here, we see RTS-CTS medium reservation 2347 equals off. So this is the default setting. I had not changed it. So the RTS-CTS functionality, or this transmission mode, is disabled as a default. However, if I were to change this number to anything between 0 and 2346, that would enable RTS with a threshold. So this simply means that I can control which packets are announced using the request to send frame and which packets are cleared to be sent by the wireless station by using the cleared to send frame. So because collisions usually affect larger packets than smaller packets, what we can do with this configuration is that we can set the RTS-CTS threshold to only respond to or only work for packets over a certain size limit. So if I type in, say for example, 2000, RTS-CTS would have a threshold of 2000, meaning that it would not be used unless the packet size was 2000 or larger, 2000 bytes or larger. So again, in this example, 2000 bytes would be the threshold, or the trigger point, if you will, for using RTS-CTS to send frames over the wireless medium. So the very last step of this entire process is, how do the frames actually get placed onto the wireless medium and pulled off the wireless medium? And that's done through a process called modulation. And modulation is a physical layer function, and this is the physical layer of the OSI model. And the physical layer is basically responsible for sending and receiving bits of information. And a bit is a binary digit, and a bit can be represented either as a 1 or a 0. So at the modulation process, we're basically preparing the data to be sent digitally over the wireless medium. Now, if you're not too familiar about the 7 layers of the OSI model, or you just simply haven't looked at it for a while and you need a little quick refresher about what it consists of, you can go to any major search engine, Yahoo or Google, and type in OSI model, and you'll get many, many links for what the OSI model is and the actual diagram of an OSI model. Here's one such search result. And so this web page here gives a good overview of what the OSI model is and the 7 layers of the OSI model. So you might want to take a quick overview of what the OSI model is just to get a better grasp of what we've been talking about in this video. So having said that, let's go back to our whiteboard here. Now, the essential definition of modulation, which again occurs at the physical layer, is that the radio transceiver in the wireless network adapter blends the data into a carrier signal for transmission over the radio frequency. And the carrier signal is basically the frequency that is modulated to carry an analog or a digital signal. In this instance, it's a digital signal. And so this is very similar to what happens when we're listening to a radio. In radio, there are two types of modulation. We have FM and AM. So we have frequency modulation, which is FM, and amplitude modulation, which is AM. And what happens is the audio signal is blended or mixed in with the AM or FM carrier signal, depending on which one is being used. And the modulation process blends or adds this data to the carrier signal by altering the amplitude, frequency, or the phase of the carrier signal. Now, knowing what type of modulation technology is used by your wireless LAN devices is helpful to ensure compatibility among those devices. So, to that end, I've created a handy-dandy reference table of the different modulation technology types used by wireless LAN devices. And let me bring that table up right now. So again, this is more for your reference, and what you'll find when you purchase wireless LAN devices is that on, say for example, the side of the box that contains the wireless network adapter, one of the specifications will include the modulation technology that's technologies that's used by that wireless LAN adapter. And with that brings us to the end of this video. Let's bring up a whiteboard and do a quick recap of what we've learned. So in this video, we learned the key essentials of how wireless LAN devices communicate. We learned the steps that a wireless LAN device must go through when using DCF and PCF transmission modes to gain access to the wireless medium in order to transmit the data. Now, remember that DCF is a contention-based mode, whereas PCF is a contention-less-based mode for gaining access to the medium. Also, that CSMA/CA is the contention protocol that's used on wireless LANs to avoid collisions. And we also learned about the three interframe spacing types, which again are SIFS, PIFS, and DIFS, and how these relate to the DCF mode and the PCF mode. And then we learned that DCF mode supports a second transmission method called request to send, clear to send, which is not enabled as a default on wireless access points. And remember that the basic process of request to send, clear to send is that the wireless station will send out a broadcast, a request to send frame, trying to reserve the wireless medium, and then we'll wait a response for this request by listening for a clear to send frame. And then we finish off by learning that modulation is the process of blending the data into a carrier signal so that the data can be sent over the radio frequency. And with that brings us to the end. I hope that this video has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.